floor is now Dan Robinett's.
I'm kind of soft-spoken, so if I get talking low and you can't hear me, please holler out. That won't Anyway, I'm going to get right to it. Fortunately, we have a lot of photographic evidence in southern Arizona of what has happened to some of our semi-desert grasslands. And I just have a few paired photo scenes for you. This is the Boundary Monument there by Sassabee, Arizona, when it was erected in 1893. And then Dr. Robert Humphrey's retake in 1983, kind of showing the magnitude of change. And you can even pick out stuff. You see the rocks here at the base of the monument. There's been a lot of soil erosion that's happened there too. David Griffith's picture, 1902, of where Fano viewed on the Santa Rita. And 100 years later, Mitch McLaren's picture, pretty dramatic. This is an old Soil Conservation Service picture, actually not that old, that Linda and I took, showing some real pretty native grassland here, now dominated by young mesquite and Leyland lovegrass. And just a final picture across the region, one of Ray Turner's photo stations in the San Bernardino Valley, showing mesquite encroachment into that Tobosa grassland down there. I did want to touch a little bit on mesquite species here. We have 3 native in Arizona and 1 that's introduced. These first 2, velvet mesquite and western honey mesquite, are the mesquites that are problems on semi-desert grasslands in the region. From this diagram, you can see velvet mesquite is bipinnately compound. The leaflets are really crowded on the rachis, and with a hand lens, you can see that pubescence. It's real characteristic. The western honey mesquite, glabrous, it's not hairy on the leaflets, it's just pinnately compound, and the gap between the leaflets is about as wide as the leaflets are. Real easy characteristic. We do have screwbean mesquite along the rivers. It's not a rangeland plant issue. Just some pictures of those. This is our velvet mesquite, which is a tree form. You can see the crowded leaflets there on the plant. And this is all across southern Arizona, from the Colorado River into western New Mexico. Gets pretty good size. This is western honey mesquite or Tory mesquite. It's a low-forming shrub, kind of a creeping thing, multi-stem. In sandy areas, it can form dunes. A lot of this in Cochise, Graham County, Arizona, all across southern New Mexico into western Texas. You can see the leaflets, the spacing on the leaflets there. And then real honey mesquite is an accidental introduction in Arizona. It's the mesquite of eastern New Mexico and Texas. A really pretty tree. This one's on the old railroad right away through the Babacomi Ranch, where probably cattle were shipped on that railroad in the 50s, 40s, and 50s and 60s, and probably seeds came out of Texas cattle. You can see the big leaflets here, and that's significant from a herbicide standpoint we'll talk about in a little bit. I've got some slides of pros and cons of mesquite. I thought I'd just list. These are things people talk about. Some of the positive aspects of mesquite moving into these desert grasslands is it does provide forage and shade for livestock, and not just cows, but other livestock like honeybees. And at critical times when there isn't much green out there on the rangeland. It's really good habitat for a variety of wildlife, especially birds, lizards, and rodents. It's food, shade, landscaping for people, and it provides wood products, which are pretty neat. Here's some of the negatives, and I know there's people could add to these lists on end, but when mesquite gets very dense on these grasslands, it really increases the cost and time involved in finding and handling livestock. Also, when canopy covers get up over 20% on a lot of soils, very low forage production and soil erosion can accelerate. For grassland species of both plants and animals, as mesquite encroaches, it can really negatively affect them. Species like pronghorn and these grassland sparrows, bears, and grasshopper sparrow, as mesquite densities increase, they just basically leave. They can't tolerate that. And then mesquite encroachment into areas where there is a water table is an issue. It's quite an issue here in southern Arizona. So the mesquite problem, from a rangeland standpoint, was recognized as early as the 1890s. Investigations began into this issue in the 40s and 50s here in the Southwest, places like the Santa Rita Experimental Range and the Sonoita Experimental Range. And then research results started to be applied on rangeland as early as the 60s. This is Clark Martin on the Santa Rita. He is kind of a hero of mine, quite a guy. Early research, this is a group at the Santa Rita in the 50s. They looked at mesquite biology, physiology, and then also some control techniques. And several publications, most of these are available online, and they're really interesting. I had a lot of fun putting this talk together, going through this old research. In the 60s and 70s, Ag Research Service in Tucson added to this effort with a rangeland section there, including Howard Morton and Tom Johnson, Jerry Cox, and also Gilbert Jordan with the Ag Experiment Station. Did lots of work across Arizona, looking at new herbicides, rangeland seeding, and growth control. That's a really nice old publication there. A little bit about mesquite reproduction, just to touch on it. A lot of seeds produced. They're very hard seeded, so they're persistent in the soil. One old study showed that there was reasonable germination even after 10 years of burial in the soil. Livestock really spread this plant. Native animals consume mesquite, coyotes, kangaroo rats, other critters, but nothing on the scale of when livestock came into this country. And pretty good germination right from the cow pie of mesquite seeds. And all of us that have been here on the rangeland have seen this. The seeds germinate with the summer rains. A little bit on kind of root biology of mesquite. Extensive lateral root system, as well as a really deep, heavy taproot. It's common to see these lateral roots, 100 feet out from the drip line of the plant. Here you can see the bud zone of dormant buds on the plant that can produce either aerial shoots or lateral roots. And also mesquite has the ability to store large amounts of energy below ground in the root system. So it can recover top very quickly if the top is taken off by fire or whatever means. So it's really quite a remarkable plant. So some of the early research done focused on individual plant treatments, either by cutting and applying a herbicide, or in this case a study where mesquite was actually controlled by hand. And they had this was on sandy soils. We have a lot of rock and gravel in our soils, which will dull a mattock pretty quick. I think that's why this works so well over on the Sonoita. But they had to limit their plant size to less than 30-inch crown diameter and about 1-inch stem diameter, or the people couldn't cut those stems in. But notice the per acre cost here to treat that big area of the young mesquite stand. They were paying their laborers 45 cents an hour. Not sure we'd get away with that. Diesel is found to be very effective hand application. It must be enough diesel applied right at ground level to penetrate to the bud zone. And that zone of dormant buds on mesquite is closest to the soil surface on hill slopes where soils are shallow to bedrock, and there's been some erosion around the plant. And they're very deepest in floodplains and alluvial fans where sediment can cover the base of the tree. 1 gallon will treat 4 to 8 medium-sized trees. I talked to Fred Shirley, he's retired in Green Valley, and Mark, thank you for hooking me up with him. He said it can be applied anytime during the year when the soil is dry, but the soil has to be dry. It chemically grows the plant. Pretty good effect on upland mesquite, not so good on wildland mesquite. Broadcast applications of herbicides. 2,4,5-T was used in the 50s. Research done on the Santa Rita and Sonoita Experimental Range. Applied in this period, and they found that 2 applications were needed a year apart because 2,4,5-T basically just top kills the plant. They got about 50% mortality with these treatments. A 20-year study that Dwight Cable did on the Santa Rita showed some interesting information. I think that was gleaned in a previous talk about, or Phil's talk about forage production. But for 6 years, it doubled, the treatment doubled forage production on the treated areas. After 20 years, there's no significant difference. Several private ranchers in the 60s in southern Arizona applied 2,4,5-T with very poor results because they just did a single spray 1 year and didn't follow up with it. Basically just top killed the plants. All of that kind of came to an abrupt halt in 1969. The Tonto National Forest and Salt River Project were doing watershed treatments to increase water yields in Chaparral up there. And an aerial spray in June of '69 with a lot of drift of herbicide. A landowner was sprayed, some farm animals were sprayed. A huge controversy over that and subsequent liability just put the stop to the use of this. And this was not Agent Orange, this was just 2,4,5-T. It wasn't the 2,4,5-T, 2,4-D that was contaminated with dioxin. But anyway, I think we're going into an era where there's some new herbicides being tested for aerial broadcast spraying. And I think we've really got to be cautious about what we do and do it right. Because I think this still exists. So that was an old Society for Rangeland field day looking at some of those treatments up there. Mechanical control of mesquite developed in Texas. A lot of implements put together to try to control mesquite. One interesting thing going through the literature is looking at cost of these different methods in the 60s versus current day. Chaining mesquite. This is a large operation, 2 big crawling tractors needed. These are anchor chains from battleships and destroyers. A lot of this was done in the 70s in the Altar Valley. It covers the ground real quickly. There's pretty good control of large trees that the chain will actually rip out of the ground. If chaining's one way, control is maybe 50% or something like that. If it's 2 ways, if they come back and chain it the other way again, it's pretty complete. But very poor control of small trees. They're so flexible, the chain just rolls over and it scarifies the seed. It spreads cholla and prickly pear like crazy. And most of that was not readily apparent when this was first done, but the ranchers I've talked to that had experience with this said that is a real negative. Root plowing mesquite. A very large tractor is required, pretty low rate of application. It does cut mesquite below the bud zone. It can rip up dense soil clay layers and improve infiltration. Very, very good control. And on these areas, especially on level ground, there's no erosion and runoff for years and years after treatment. Here's some of the negatives. On soils with these clay layers pretty close to the surface, you can bring clay close to the surface, and I'll show you an example of that. It pretty much kills everything out there. So if you have native grass remnants there, they're not going to be there. And you're going to have to seed unless if Lehman love gas is present, it's going to take over the area after you. This shows kind of the scale of that, and you can see that this is a pretty dramatic treatment. And on gently sloping ground like this, those areas just produce almost no runoff for 30 or 40 years after treatment. This is a ridge. Here's where the ripper shank went, here and here. This is a ridge of clay that was thrown up. That area was treated in 2006. Here it is 8 years later, and there's still no vegetation on that clay. So that's a real issue with root plowing. Bulldozing mesquite, on the other hand, which is using a tractor with a front-mounted dozer blade, usually an angle blade that can get down and pop the root crown out of the ground. Works pretty good on scattered stands. You don't need quite as big a tractor. Here's some of the pros. And here's some of the cons. It is pretty slow going, and people tend to miss young plants. When you're out there on a bulldozer looking for plants to go, it's pretty easy to miss the little ones. They take almost as much time as the medium-sized ones. This is some work we were involved in with Sheridan Stone on Fort Huachuca back in the 90s. Any type of mesquite control is going to require maintenance to have an adequate lifespan. A real recent study off of the Santa Rita that was just published showed that treated areas were reinfested within 6 years, up to 10% mesquite canopy. So it's really going to come in, when you do this, it's going to come in pretty quick afterwards. There's a lot of seed out there, plants that you didn't get the root crown on, are going to sprout. And it's amazing how quick that comes in. This is an example from Elkhorn Ranch, and Charlie and Mary Miller are here today. I told Charlie, his daughter took some pictures of him last week spraying, and I told him I wasn't going to show him face on, so I got one like that. Anyway, there's that example, but it's still Charlie. So they bulldozed 1,000 acres over 7 or 8 years on the ranch of private land at a cost of about $35 an acre. And even with wildfires in '94 and 2009 that went across most of that treated area, they had to come back in with hand treatments beginning in 2002 to retreat. And you can see the level of regrowth in mesquite and cattail acacia there. Other mechanical methods for mesquite control, we've got tree shear, tree grinder. They basically take the top off. People are using track hose and backhoes now to extract mesquite, which is very effective, expensive. And implements like the imprinter and roller choppers basically just crush the top hill. A little bit about prescribed fire. We know it was important ecological process. Some of the research done on Santa Rita showed that a lot more fine fuel was needed to get effective mortality on mesquite, this established mesquite, than we grow out here. That's a lot, and that was added, straw was added to those treatments to produce the effect there. Linda has a poster here you can look at that talks about fire and effects on mesquite. We did a lot of burning in the Altar Valley with ranchers in the 80s. This was one example. At this transect location right here before the burn, we had 1,800 pounds per acre of fine fuel before the fire. With very severe fire, we had 5% or less mesquite mortality. This was a fire in mountain slopes, a range monitoring transect that happened to burn in 2002. And this is not a scientific study by any means, but it does illustrate the fact that on these shallow soils with bedrock close to the surface and steep slopes where there's erosion, the bud zone's right at the surface. And there's 4 mesquites in this transect, and 3 of them were killed by that fire. This one right here sprouted, and you can see it there. There's some other herbicides that are coming out for mesquite use now. These 2 are the only ones that are licensed for use for aerial broadcast spray in Arizona at this time. They've had very good luck with these in Texas on honey mesquite, but with those big leaves, and it's kind of a more mesic plant, it's easier to get the herbicide into the plant. Not such good luck in New Mexico, mostly on western honey mesquite, and very poor luck in Arizona with this so far. Again, the hardest part of any foliar application of herbicide is getting the stuff into the plant where it can kill it. These are the references I gleaned to pull together this information. There's a lot of neat stuff here. See, these are older ones from the 50s and 60s and newer ones and some books. And that's my talk. Thank you.